because you insisted no new wars.
First of all, I didn't guarantee no war. Why would I have built the strongest military in the world? I built our military. I inherited a terrible military. We had no equipment. We had nothing. I built a tremendous military. Biden gave a lot of it away, but it's still a relatively small portion compared to what I built.
But you said it over and over again, Mr. President.
Why would I build a military? When you say I promised, I didn't promise anything. I don't like these endless wars. This is not an endless war.
Hi again, everyone. It is 5 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. Except he did promise no new wars. And he said it not just once, but many times on the campaign trail, and even on election night. Let's just roll the tape.
Under Trump, we will have no more wars, no more disruptions, and we will have prosperity and peace for all. No more wars, no more disruptions. We will have prosperity and we will have peace. With our victory in November, the years of war, weakness, and chaos will be over. I don't have wars. If properly stated, it would never start. They said, he will start a war. I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
If Donald Trump is consistent about one thing, it is saying one thing and doing another. But this time, it is a massive campaign promise that he did not keep. The war in Iran is now over 100 days long. Its impact is being felt significantly here at home. Americans are seeing the prices at the pump continue to soar. Politico's survey last month found that over a half, 53% of Americans say the cost of living is the worst they can remember. Trump's niece, Mary Trump, weighed in on how this is all a disaster of his own making, and he has no way out.
It's absolutely stunning what a debacle this is, and it is entirely his responsibility. He can't, he will blame other people, but nobody is going to fall for that because he didn't ask for the permission of Congress. He didn't ask for the permission of our allies. He didn't actually sell it to the American people. Iran is holding all of the cards right now. So one of Donald's favorite myths about himself is being exposed for the nonsense it is. He is not a great deal maker. In fact, he doesn't know what he's doing at all.
That, his broken promises, and a mess of his own making is where we begin this hour with Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. He is a Marine Corps combat veteran and now serves on the House Armed Services Committee. Also joining us, military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. He served as the commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe. Also joining us, Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Van Landingham. She served in the Air Force, and as a JAG officer, she is now a professor at Southwestern Law School. Congressman, before we talk about the politics of this, because there are lots of promises made, promises broken, in this case, this seems like the promise where the stakes are the highest for the military men and women who have already lost their lives, for those whose parents feel that they are living on a knife's edge, waiting for this administration to decide whether or not they're going to put boots on the ground. When you talk to your own constituents, how do you articulate the stakes of this war?
Well, they're extraordinarily high. If you're a parent or a family member of one of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines over there in the Middle East right now, and I've talked to parents of Marines sitting on ships off the coast of Iran, just wondering if their sons will go into combat in a war that not only is going poorly, that clearly has had no plan from the very beginning, but a war that, frankly, we're losing. Trump said he wouldn't start wars. He also didn't say he would lose them. Well, he's doing both. He started wars, and right now he's losing a war, giving Iran more leverage. They're holding the global economy hostage, and Trump doesn't have a way out.
General Hertling, I want to pick up on what the congressman said there, which is picking up on what Mary Trump had said earlier, which is that the president doesn't have a way out. The problem with that is that it's not just the president who doesn't have the way out. If he cannot find an off-ramp here, if he is not willing to take the loss, then it means that we all do not have a way out of this quagmire. Your sense, what an off-ramp would look like, who it is he should be listening to, and why he is not.
Yeah, Alicia, that's the toughest question I get is what's the off-ramp? it's too late to consider that. You have to consider what the off-ramp is before you start a war. And again, I'd like to go back a little bit if I could and even talk about the premise of any presidential candidate saying, you know, I'm not going to have any wars. You can't predict that. I mean, the world is so complex right now, and the very fact that he even predicted that was a wrong approach to take. But then to get into a war of his own making, I think without a very good plan, without an objective or an end state, is where we are right now. The end state now, the off-ramp, if you will, is not dependent on his actions alone. He has to do some coordination with the one ally he has, Israel. We've seen that being faulty. And he also has to understand that the enemy always gets a vote. And in this case, the enemy, being Iran, has already cast their vote in terms of what they want from a peace negotiation or a ceasefire. And the president is not willing to give up money, not willing to give up sanctions that are already in place against Iran. He only wants one thing, and it's the one thing that Iran probably is not going to give him unless they get something of this too. So again, going back to talking about the great deal maker that Mary Trump was talking about, he's not very good at making deals. And he also sets himself up for failure by making bad promises during the campaign, which no president can keep when it comes to the complexity of the global environment.
Professor Van Landingham, I constantly remain struck by the fact that he claims it's not a war, but then he calls it a war, and like either he and his administration can't get their talking points together. So if we take the president's word, and this is in fact a war, then under what authority has he taken the nation to the brink?
Well, we have to be at war. Otherwise, the United States would not be allowed to be engaged in a blockade of the entire Iranian coast. A blockade is a tool of war. So, of course, we're at war. And I don't think the American people nor anyone around the globe is fooled by his rhetoric that we're not at war. The American public sees it at the gas pumps. It sees it at the high cost of living. The Iranian civilians that remember that we're 3 months past a terrible strike that killed over 170 Iranian little girls and their teachers. And the Iranian civilians are still caught in the crosshairs, as are the Israeli civilians that were running to bomb shelters over the weekend, as are Lebanese civilians. And so the idea that we're not at war is ludicrous. Iran fired over 30 ballistic missiles at Israel over the weekend, and Israel retaliated, and Israel is engaged in armed conflict in Lebanon. So to say that we're not at war is really offensive to the rest of the world and to the American people. We know what's going on, and there absolutely, of course, there's an off ramp, but it's going to be one that does not achieve the U.S. objectives here.
Right. And I think, Congressman, part of what you see is that Republicans in your chamber are beginning to catch on to that. So we're in this war without congressional approval. Last week, the House passed with bipartisan support a war powers resolution. Help us understand what that does and what then happens next.
Well, it just finally shows what Congress is saying privately behind the scenes, including many Republicans, which is that we're losing this war, and it's a really bad idea. Because gas prices are up, food prices are going up. The economy is getting strangled by Iran. We've got hundreds of civilians dead, including, as we just heard, little girls and their teachers. We've got 14 of America's finest who have died. And what's Iran got? Well, they still got their nuclear weapons program. They now have the Strait of Hormuz. So when you look at what's going on here, it's not only that we're stuck in this war, it's that an enemy of the United States is actually winning this war. But I do think there is one thing that Trump has achieved. And this is an objective that we don't talk about enough because it sounds political. But I think the one objective that really matters to Donald Trump is something he has achieved, which is, guess what? We're not talking about Jeffrey Epstein. We'll talk about Todd Blanche. We'll talk about Iran today. We're not talking about the one thing that has hurt Trump with his base. So why would he break this promise that he has made for years, that he will start no wars? That, to me, is the obvious answer. And Trump actually is getting that.
I do want to say that here on Deadline, on the weeknight, which I am on most nights, we have continued to follow that story because I agree with you. We need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And the problem is, as you know, if one thing becomes a distraction, everything's a distraction. He is actually able to pull off multiple things at the same time.